Chapter 6. A Most Important Delivery. Carrying Louis in his hand, Jax brought the eldest Tiny up to the main level and headed toward the supply room, where Evan was getting the train ready. Louis still wore his oxygen mask and was holding the small attached cylinder. "We're going to send you back in with oxygen," the professor said to him. "When the train enters paradise, you will likely be able to remove your mask. But it's fine for you to keep it on until you reach the carrying center. I don't want you to have any physical distress." Louis nodded. Handing him a very small brown envelope, the professor added gently, "This letter contains information about the cave and how to use a phone. Give it to Amy when you have a private opportunity. The sooner, the better, as we need daily reports on the patients. Ensure she understands that she is not to publicize this message. I would like to keep our communication a secret for as long as we can." There was another nod as Louis slid the little envelope into his pocket. The professor picked up the stretcher and gently placed Louis on it. Then Evan loaded him carefully onto the first car of the train, hoping he'd be discovered as soon as possible. For good measure, they placed an extra oxygen bottle beside him. "Goodbye, son," Jack said sadly, reaching one finger into the train to pat Louis's folded hands. "I'm so thankful that you are still with us. Take it easy and don't be in a hurry to get out of bed. Your books will come soon. Remember how much I love you." Louis closed his eyes briefly and patted the giant finger. Evan's eyes welled up with tears as they shut the doors and sent the train in. "We've got to watch this," the professor said earnestly to Evan. "Are you okay for time?" "Summer holidays," Evan smiled, although he wasn't sure what holidays meant anymore. His classroom studies were over until September, but he had no plans to leave the biosphere. Walking through the long corridor into the Paradise Room, they witnessed Kenzie, Vahid, and Milan rush down the half-finished stairway on Rainbow Hill to meet the incoming train. The young men grabbed carry carts from the store and ran over. "Hey, is that Odin joining them?" Evan asked quietly. Sure enough, Odin came from the charred forest toward the train. "He's already cleared a lot of the debris," the professor whispered. "And look at that," Evan pointed out. "He's collected a cart full of rocks." "That's incredible," the professor observed. "He doesn't even have Louis to supervise his work or Ponzi to help him. This is encouraging." Curiously, the scientists watched Odin approach the train. From the microphone near the store, they could hear him ask if the guys wanted any help. "Sure," Kenzie replied. "There's likely a lot to carry." Opening the first car, he discovered live cargo. "Guys!" Kenzie called it with great excitement. "Uncle Louis is in here, and he's alive!" Everyone peered in to see. Uncle Louis's eyes were smiling, but he kept his oxygen mask on. "Should we take you to the caring center?" Kenzie asked, seeing that the older Tiny was lying on a stretcher. Removing his mask briefly, Uncle Louis said, "Yes, please take me there. I'm so glad to be back with you all." With a happy smile, Kenzie called out, "Grab an end, everyone!" Slowly they pulled the stretcher out of the car, and everyone took one end of the poles. Together the young men marched slowly yet triumphantly up the hill. Never had there been a more important delivery in paradise. Odin didn't meet Uncle Louis's eyes, but he put all his muscle into bringing the stretcher up the hill as evenly as possible. The rock stairway made the climb easier. Once they reached the narrow path, Kenzie warned, "Careful you don't trip." Then he said to Odin, "See what a big difference you've made already? Your staircase will be appreciated by everyone who goes up and down this hill." Odin acknowledged the compliment with a grunt, and he didn't complain about the work. Just before they reached the clearing at the top of the hill, the stocky Tiny with the wild blonde hair asked, "Uncle Louis, what do you have on your face?" Taking the mask off, the elder Tiny answered, "To survive in the big world, I had to wear this constantly. The tank holds the right mixture of oxygen. It comes through the tube and into the mask, and then I can breathe it in. I am likely all right now without it," he acknowledged, but with a shrug he put it back on anyway. Frowning thoughtfully, Odin nodded. "What was it like on the other side?" he asked. "Quite dark and boring," Uncle Louis replied, taking off the mask again and deciding he didn't need it. "If your life is in danger, it's a good place to recover, but it's not nearly so beautiful as paradise." "Really?" Odin questioned dubiously. "I'm very glad to be back home," Uncle Louis smiled. When they reached the girls' mansion, Kenzie yelled out toward the upstairs windows, "We've got Uncle Louis! The professor brought him back to life! The nurses were first to run downstairs and open the door. Santa and Lily excused themselves from holding hands with their patients and raced after the others. It was a jubilant welcome for Uncle Louis as he entered the house in a prone position. Once inside, he was pleased to receive hugs from Amy and Santa while still lying down. "I'm so thankful to be back with you all," he rejoiced. "How are my injured boys?" "We'll show you," Kenzie replied, encouraging his team to continue with the stretcher. Marching up the stairs, they brought Uncle Louis to his new bed, right next to the big window and beside the two most severely injured young men. Right away, Uncle Louis noticed that Zahir and Ponzi were only semi-conscious. They barely acknowledged his presence. "Sedation is working," he thought. There was a joyful reception from everyone else. The Beach Boys hobbled to the doorway of George's old room to say hello, while Santa danced and sang. Vanitha, Georgia, and the kitchen crew stood with the others, panting a little from their long run from the store. They hadn't had time to shower, so they weren't allowed in the room, but they waved happily and called out cheerful greetings. On his own initiative, Odin carried up the pink sofa from the living room. "You'll need this chair for visitors," he said flatly. Kenzie and Amy thanked him and positioned it against the wall. With great joy, everyone celebrated that Uncle Louis was home and still alive. Chapter 7. Hurting to Help. Amy awoke the next morning to a loud crash outside the window. Bright light shone into the dark room. "Time to get breakfast ready," she told herself sleepily, and then she realized she was not in her own room. Lily was lying in the bed beside her. Curious about the crash, she ran to the window and saw that one big pine tree that had once shaded Lily's window was lying flat on the ground. Its tiny roots were helplessly exposed. Hearing Ponzi cry out in pain, the copper-haired girl remembered that she was now a nurse, and her patients needed her help. Slipping quickly into her clothes with a smile, Amy glanced at Lily's newly bright window. With the room at the far end of the house, she could see out over the forested hills, and to the left the lake was sparkling in the distance. She was sad the beautiful tree had fallen over, but happy to have morning sunshine and a better view. Lily looked up wearily. "You getting up already?" she groaned. "Why is it so bright in here?" "The patients need their medicine," Amy replied. "And your tree fell over." Heading into the hallway, the copper-haired nurse saw bags of clean bandages, equipment, and medication piled neatly outside of her old room. With a smile, she washed her hands carefully in the pot of soapy water. It was the second day since the fire, and she loved her new assignment. Vahid came out of the critical care room. He had been on night duty. "I had to give everyone more pain medication last night," he told her quietly. "They were really suffering. Did you hear them?" "I didn't hear anything last night," Amy admitted. "I slept so soundly. I'm really thankful you guys are doing the night shift." Rubbing his dark beard with both his hands, Vahid nodded wearily. "I think they are anxious for the next round of medications," he yawned. "Do you want some help?" Amy laughed kindly. "You look like you need a break," she smiled. "Tina and Yu-Yan will be here soon. I'll be fine, but thanks for the offer." "Okay, I really need more sleep," Vahid yawned, heading for the stairs. "I'll check back in later." Looking at the tall bottles of painkiller, antibiotics, medication, and formula, Amy read over the instructions twice. They had pinned up the important messages in the hallway. She was anxious to get everything right. Glancing over at the clock in her old room, she saw that it was 7 in the morning. As Vahid had said, many of the patients were awake and 2 were groaning in pain. Using the pipette, she carefully filled everyone's cups with the exact amount prescribed. By the time she had given all 6 patients the first dose of painkiller, Tina and Yu-Yan had arrived with wet hair from their showers, ready to help change the bandages. Lima and Damien were standing in the doorway. "Let's get this day going, girls," Damien teased, holding out his bandaged arm. "We have important things to do." Kenzie came running up the stairs as Amy picked up a new wad of gauze. "Can I help?" he asked eagerly. "Sure," Amy agreed. I've done the painkiller, but not the protein formula or the antibiotics. Great, he said. I'll do that. Emma, Damien's golden retriever, waggled into the crisis room to say good morning to the patients. She had been sleeping in the room next door, unable to get through the night without her master. Dogs should not be in this room around open injuries, Uncle Louis objected sharply. We can't afford infection right now. Amy coaxed Emma out of the crisis room and brought her back to her master. Damien was admiring George's artwork that decorated her walls. She's really good, isn't she? He remarked, pointing to the painting of Freda that hung by the window. Georgia and Vanitha have the creative touch, the young nurse agreed, with her hand on Emma's head. Uncle Louis says dogs aren't allowed in the crisis room. I'm just going to take her outside. Damien turned around and smiled. He had a bandage on one leg and his right arm, but he could walk fine. I'll take her outside, he said. She'd probably love a walk on the beach. Actually, Amy replied, you aren't supposed to go outside until you have scabs on those wounds. Says who? Come and see, the girl with the deep blue eyes encouraged. Outside the room, she showed him the instructions pinned up on the wall. If you get any dirt or unsafe water onto those wounds right now, you could wind up in the crisis room. This is terrible, Damon protested. I can't stay inside all day. The other Beach Boys had been listening into the conversation and added their disapproval. What are we going to do? It's so boring in here. Santa burst through the doorway 1 level below. Georgia Milan and Nancy followed her in with board games and books. Look what came in on the train, they shouted. Check it out, Damien exclaimed, clapping his hands together. Now we have something to do. Amy took Emma downstairs and led her outside. Washing her arms and hands again carefully, Amy returned to her old room. Tina and Yu Yan were across the hall attending to the surfer's moderate injuries, which were already forming scabs. When I'm finished here, I'll come help you with Ponzi, Yu Yan told Amy. Georgia and Lily ducked in to say a quick good morning to Zahir, Ponzi, and Uncle Louis. Then they hurried off to get breakfast ready. The caring center reverberated with cries of distress as the nurses tended to the messy sores. Zahir and Ponzi were finally awake and aware of everything that was happening. It took much longer to care for their burns and for the other 3 tinies, as their injuries were larger and much more severe. Dead, peeling skin and oozing fluid had to be gently cleaned and removed if it came off easily. It was not a job for the faint-hearted or those with sensitive noses. While Kenzie carefully measured doses from the eyedropper bottles and brought them around to both rooms, Amy and Yu Yan applied antibiotic cream with very clean hands onto the gauze and then wound it around their patient's injured legs. Having Uncle Louis in the room was reassuring for them all. He couldn't do anything to help in a physical way, but he could offer advice and encouragement. As Amy and Yu Yan worked, he explained many principles behind germs, infection, and compassionate caring. He passed on all that he could remember from Rachel's explanations. Even though he had been given the pain medication that morning, Zahir cried out and flinched badly when Amy tried to take off his bandages. Even the slightest movement against the injuries caused him to react. I'm so sorry I have to do this to you, she apologized sadly. Moisten the gauze first, Uncle Louis instructed both nurses, recalling a tip that he hadn't passed on yet. That will help. Zahir nodded weakly, closing his eyes and clenching his jaw. Tip worked well. When the copper-haired nurse had changed the dressings on her patient's right forearm and lower leg, she turned to his face and neck. With a sterile wipe, she dabbed at the oozing sores, trying to gently remove any loose, dead tissue. Following the instructions on the wall, she soaked a new strip of gauze in a saline solution and rubbed it with the antibacterial cream. Then she gently covered the wound and wrapped it around his head. It was such a large burn, stretching from his jaw right up into his hairline. When she was done, Zahir reached out his left hand for hers. Please stay, he begged, closing his eyes. Chairs had been positioned near the beds to make it easier to dress the wounds. With great compassion welling up, Amy walked around and sat down between the 2 burn patients. She took Zahir's hand gladly. Hey, what about me? Ponzi pleaded. He held out his hand. With a kind smile, Amy took his as well. Her second patient was mischievous and had made a lot of mistakes, including starting the fire, but there was something endearing about the comical troublemaker. For a few minutes, the young nurse told them both about the way the sun was sparkling on the lake and that the deer were walking around outside the mansion, wondering why she had forgotten to bring treats the night before. Having followed Uncle Louis's helpful advice as well, Yu Yan was trying to unwrap the bandages around Poncy's legs. Never a one to suffer quietly, Poncy vocalized every stab of pain and squeezed Amy's hand so hard that it ached. "Just lie still," Yu Yan begged. "I can't wipe this sore if you are thrashing around like this." "But it hurts so badly," Poncy yelled. Kenzie was still helping Tina with the Beach Boys. "I need to help you, Yan," Amy apologized, letting go of both the hands she was holding. "I think Poncy needs more pain medication." Zahir winced. "Is your pain bearable?" she asked. With his eyes closed, he nodded. "Is there anything you need?" "A drink, please." Amy got up to measure the dosages for both patients. Poncy was given more pain medication, and then she brought over their special protein formula. Zahir had only been injured on his right side falling into the flames, and he was able to drink from a cup himself. Both of Poncy's arms hurt to move, so Amy helped him with his dose. Hearing the kitchen crew coming up the path with breakfast, Amy assisted Yu Yan with Poncy's wounds. While the vocal, bronze-skinned Tiny had severe injuries just like the patient beside him, his face was untouched. However, there were burn wounds on all Poncy's limbs and a narrow section on his chest. Had Lima not doused the fire on their clothes quickly during the flare-up, the damage would have been even worse. Uncle Louis was able to sit up a little and watch as they worked. "Poncy," he said with concern, "you will need to move your arms every few hours. That one burn is over a joint, and you don't want the skin to grow back too tightly to move." "But it hurts to move," Poncy complained. "Just move it whenever your pain medication is working well," Uncle Louis suggested. "Girls, you may need to help him exercise that arm," he encouraged. "Just a little every few hours. Sometimes you have to hurt to help." "Hurt to help?" Amy echoed curiously, wondering to herself how that fit with the professor's rule, no hurting. "Did you hear that, Poncy?" she teased kindly. "Sometimes you have to hurt to help." "Ah, no, no, no!" Poncy cried out dramatically. "No more pain!" "Breakfast has arrived," Santa sang out merrily, standing in the doorway. She and Milan passed bowls of fruit salad and loaves of bread to Amy, who placed them on the window seat. "Fruit salad!" Uncle Louis rejoiced. "Thank you." Staying at the door, since they hadn't showered that morning and the stench from the patients had grown stronger, the kitchen crew briefly asked how everyone was doing and received varied replies. Kenzie walked in with a large jug of orange juice and cups that Nancy had given him. "Thank you for breakfast," Amy and Yu Yan called out gratefully, returning to finish loosely winding the medicated gauze around Poncy's leg. "You're welcome," the kitchen workers replied, and then they made a rather hasty exit, putting their hands over their noses as they dashed down the stairs. Zahir and Poncy didn't want any food, but Uncle Louis wasn't concerned, since they were drinking a potent formula every couple of hours. Georgia appeared at the door with Lily, who had helped her carry a new book that had come in on the train. "Do you want me to read to you today?" she asked. "It's an adventure story." "Please," Zahir said. "Sounds great," Uncle Louis piped up. "Me too," Poncy agreed. However, Georgia never stepped inside the room. Her face screwed up slightly as a smell of dead skin and unwashed bodies overpowered her. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said. "It smells really bad in here." Uncle Louis chuckled. "You've got a sensitive nose," he remarked. "Try again in a few days. Things may improve as everyone heals." "I love you, Zahir," Georgia called out in a muffled fashion as she dashed away. "I love you too," the dark-haired patient replied quietly, as he always did. Then he asked, "Do we stink?" With a sudden lump in her throat, Amy laid her hand on his good arm and smiled. "My nose isn't sensitive." "Thanks for staying with us," he murmured. Chapter 8. Rachel's Inquiry. It was a cold, rainy April morning when the professor opened the blue-tinted doors of the rainforest biome to head inside. He had plenty on his mind. Paradise had made headlines in the Canadian news after the first scientists had arrived earlier that week. He had been told that the video of the tinies fighting the fire would air that evening, and already the news was out. The cameraman had relayed what he'd filmed to the scientists, and from there the news had spread. Now Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter were sharing the story far and wide. He could hardly keep up with the incoming messages. Everyone wanted to know how the courageous Sahir was doing. Was he badly burned? Had Uncle Louis survived? Was Ponzi okay? To Jack's surprise, generous donations were flooding in to handle the healthcare expenses. The media interest and the expressions of grief coming in from all sides were rather overwhelming. Even the university governing board had softened their stand on his reprehensible project and were now asking if they could do anything to help. Bewildered, the professor found it hard to accept that the disaster he would have expected to bring a shameful end to his experiment and the popularity of paradise was actually promoting it worldwide. Walking into the warm, humid greenhouse, Jack savored the soothing environment. A chorus of howler monkeys greeted him. The macaws chimed in, and even the leopard roared. With a slight smile, he looked around at the lovely oasis that brought him so much joy. He adored the rainforest biosphere. "Good to see you this morning," Rachel called out. Kneeling by the fish pond, she was checking the pH levels. Jax waved. "Great to see you, too." "How are all the patients?" she asked. "Why don't you come with me and see what's happening this morning?" he encouraged. "We are still trying to establish communication. Hopefully I'll hear from Amy soon." Nodding fervently, Rachel replied, "Thank you, I'd love to come." Leaving her box of tubes and chemicals by the pond, the young doctor followed Jax into the viewing hall. Walking through all the doors and hallways, they discussed the glum April weather, Uncle Louis's return to the dome, and their hopes that all the patients were progressing well. Reaching the Paradise Room, they stood outside the dome near Rainbow Hill and looked through the tinted one-way viewing glass. Only a few tinies were outside, attending to their morning activities. "I wish we could see how the burn victims are," the lovely dark-haired doctor fretted quietly. "I know," Jax whispered. "While I strongly believe they should have complete privacy in their own homes, it would be helpful to have a camera in the caring center." He shook his head. "It's too late now. I have that emergency room down in the lab, but I never anticipated the need for Paradise to have a proper hospital. I hope Amy will send us an update soon. She just needs to figure out how to use a smartphone." "How will she do that?" "I sent in some instructions this morning. Louis will help her if there's anything she doesn't understand. We should hear from her tonight. I'll message you as soon as I hear any details." "These are the crucial hours," Rachel murmured anxiously. "I know," Jax agreed quietly. "I hope it will go well." They watched as Georgia and Lily carried breakfast up the path to Rainbow Hill. Odin was working on the stone stairs. Georgia's voice carried well over the microphone. "You're working before breakfast?" she said with surprise. "Gotta get these stairs done," Odin grunted as he lifted a heavy rock into place. "They are needed right now." Impressed, the professor watched the stocky young man as he wheeled his cart back down from the hill for another rock. "Just 3 more rocks and you'll have the job done," he observed quietly. "He's feeling badly about what he did," the young doctor whispered. "Yes," Jax nodded. "I'm really glad to see his response. He's demonstrating real remorse for his actions." "Jax, I've been wondering about something," Rachel murmured a little nervously. "Yes?" he encouraged. "It may just be my imagination, or perhaps a foolish hope," she relayed. "But I do wonder sometimes, well, I wonder if any of the tinies might be related to me." With a smile, Jax looked over. "You did tell me once that you were an embryo donor," he whispered kindly. "So I've wondered the same thing myself." "You have?" "Certainly," he replied, stroking his goatee. "In fact, I've been very hopeful this might be the case." Fidgeting with her stethoscope, Rachel asked, "Do you think anyone in particular might be mine?" Relieved to finally have the opportunity to share his precious thoughts, now that his experiment was no longer secret, Jax nodded. "Well, there is a certain young man. It's hard to tell if he's maybe an Arab Israeli or of Jewish descent." "Sahir," she said breathlessly. Trying to remember to speak quietly, she exclaimed, "I know. I thought the same. He looks so much like Farouk, but—" "He has blue eyes," they both said together. Just like yours, Jack smiled. She nodded wistfully. And I've listened to their songs, she relayed. Maybe it's just my imagination, but Zahir sounds like my father. My father sings in the Jerusalem Symphony. Come, Jack said eagerly, suddenly struck by an idea. I have something for you. It's in the train supply room. Come with me. Rachel followed him back through the elevator and down the hallways. In the loading room, Jax picked up a few messy, soiled gauze bandages. These came in on the train this morning, he told her, sliding them into a plastic bag. Some will be Ponzi's, some will be Zahir's. They are all mixed together. If you do a DNA test, then we'll know for sure if there's any connection. Taking the bag gratefully, Rachel held it close to her heart. Thank you, she said. With an anxious expression, Jax pleaded, I just don't want to get your hopes up. She nodded. I appreciate that. I'll try not to get too excited. But thank you for this opportunity. I've been thinking about it a lot. I'll let you know when I find out. Chapter 9. The Basis of Morality. A message came in from Evan asking if he could bring Seth to view paradise from the main room. If you want, the professor replied, sitting down at his computer now that Rachel had left. He had a lot of emails that he hoped to answer that morning. Seth was still not his favorite student, but Jax knew the young man had become close friends with his research partner. Since the tall blonde assistant was integral to the future of paradise and very dear to his heart, the professor was willing to grant Evan almost anything, even if it meant allowing a questioning, probing creationist to come right into the actual paradise room. Evan showed Seth around and cautioned him to speak very softly if he was close to the dome. They looked in at the charred forest, and Seth was distraught to see the extent of the damage. For a while they whispered quietly to one another as they walked around the tall glass terrarium. Coming around to the lake, they watched Odin dig deep into Mining Hill. What are the consequences for those who started the fire? The red-haired student whispered. Looking over in the direction of the professor, Evan replied quietly, Consequences? Well, Ponzi certainly paid a heavy price for his involvement. He will be suffering for a while. Franz had some minor burns, but I suppose we hope that the whole situation was terrifying enough that he won't ever consider fooling around with fire again. And Odin, well, Odin is trying hard to make up for what he did. He's given himself consequences. I believe the experience has changed him, and if better behavior continues, then we may leave it at that. The professor looked up from his desk and nodded. I don't think any of them realized they were igniting such a destructive force. Seth nodded. So, how do you determine the basis of morality in paradise? He whispered curiously. Is it just based upon the no hurting and no stealing rules? What do you do if someone willfully disobeys? Louis talks to them, tries to reason it out, Evan explained. And when Louis is gone? We'll come up with something else, the professor retorted, his eyes fastened on the computer screen as he tried to multitask. Looking over at Evan, Seth asked softly, But what if one tiny purposefully endangers the life of another? Or if some refuse to acknowledge your rules? They respect Louis as a father figure, but will they be led by someone they consider their equal or less? Although he knew the questions were being directed at his assistant, the professor turned around in his chair. They are all good kids, he remarked softly but defensively. They've grown up with Louis as their role model. They haven't seen violence or evil. They don't need harsh consequences or a long list of rules. Seth frowned. But Jesus said that all manner of evil thoughts come from our own hearts. We don't need to see wrong behavior to act it out. It's just part of our fallen human nature. Recognizing the point, Evan considered. We didn't teach them to steal or hit each other or rebel against authority, yet those things have happened easily enough on their own. Leaning back in his chair, the professor disagreed. Such a view leaves Christians feeling demoralized and in a constant state of guilt, he argued. That is possible, Seth acknowledged, walking a few steps closer to the professor. especially if we lack faith in God's willingness to forgive us, or if we doubt that his love is specific to us and focus only on our own unworthiness, then you're right. Then we could implode with despair. But if we realize where evil comes from, we are better equipped to fight the battle, and our appreciation for God's graciousness will be much deeper. Is God gracious? The professor questioned with a wry smile. That's not the God I read about in the Old Testament. Have you read the Old Testament? Only parts of it, he admitted, but I've certainly read what others have said about him. He wiped the whole world out, even the animals. He endorsed genocide. He valued one family of people over everyone else, but he often annihilated thousands of Israelites when he lost his temper. I suggest you read Psalm 78, Seth interrupted quietly, coming even closer to the professor so his voice wouldn't startle the tinies. Having found a helpful book on Christian apologetics, Seth felt better equipped to take on such arguments. Psalm 78 summarizes God's relationship with the nation of Israel, he explained. To understand God's judgment, you need to first appreciate his great love. You see, the Jewish nation didn't choose God. He chose them because of his relationship with their fathers. He delivered them from being slaves in Egypt. He revealed his supernatural power in astonishing ways to them, like never before. He demonstrated his ability to provide food for millions in the wilderness every day for 40 years. He gave them wise laws that would keep them safe from sickness, disease, and oppressive behaviors. Wise laws, Jax interrupted with disdain. You call getting stoned to death for disrespecting your parents a wise law? Seth replied quietly, even though he was no longer near the dome. Sir, there is no record of that law ever being carried out. Same with an eye for an eye or a hand for a hand. Those laws were there to demonstrate what God thought of the sin and make everyone aware of the maximum penalty that was deserved. For some punishments, a monetary fine could be substituted. Still, did a disrespectful child deserve to die? If you read that law through carefully, you will see this was a last resort, Seth answered. It was only put in place if the parents had exhausted all other means. It was for an older son or daughter who was completely rebellious, refused to listen, and had given themselves over to worthless living and drunkenness. And it was the parents who had the option of giving their son up to the elders of the city, not the other way around. It's very severe. The Mosaic Law was given to a nation that had been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. They didn't choose God. God chose them. He met this rough group of people where they were at with all their hard-heartedness and social customs, intending to gradually bring them to Christ. God knew he had a better covenant coming for those who would willingly align their lives with his in the future. Pausing a moment, he asked, Professor Lemans, have you ever compared the Old Testament to the Code of Hammurabi, which was a Babylonian code of law around this same time? No. It's worth taking a look, Seth encouraged. Hammurabi inscribed that he was making very good and fair laws for his people, but his laws were often much more severe than God's. But your God told the Israelites to wipe out entire nations so that they could take over their land. God executed his justice in overthrowing nations that had become entirely perverse, Seth defended. He says in Leviticus 18 that if Israel didn't wipe out those nations, the land itself would have vomited them out. That land had been promised to Abraham 400 years earlier, but God didn't give it to Abraham then, as the inhabitants had not yet reached such a perverse state. The Jewish people wandered as pilgrims and endured bondage as slaves until God determined that the nations in possession of the promised land had become so wicked that his judgment was required. Shaking his head, the professor was not convinced. The God of the Old Testament is not someone I would look to should I need moral guidance in my life. He's jealous. How petty. He's vengeful. But God is jealous in a protective way, like a good husband, Seth protested. He loves us and doesn't want us to be seduced by foolish things that will ruin our happiness and take us away from living forever with him. Real love and jealousy go hand in hand. Does the theory of natural selection establish any better example? Evan inquired softly, walking over to join the discussion. Natural selection is 100% amoral, the professor admitted quietly, but it doesn't make claims to be the moral authority. I do agree that natural selection is amoral, Seth nodded. The concept of natural selection is based on selfishness and is devoid of compassion. It cares nothing for the suffering of anyone involved or any emotional responses they might have, but according to the theory, benefits itself in a physical way at the expense of all others. Isn't that true? It's called survival of the fittest for a reason, Jax acquiesced. So, how did humans evolve kindness, or self-sacrifice, or compassion? Where did these amazing qualities come from? Who started it, and why? I don't know, the professor acknowledged with a shrug. Fair enough, Seth nodded evenly. And what kind of morality do you hope you will see in paradise? Well, I hope they'll act on the basis of love and servant leadership, putting each other's needs above their own, he stated. And I have seen some remarkable examples of this in the last year. Louis has done everything he can to make his world a better place. During the fire, both Louis and Zahir risked their lives to save Ponce. Most of the Tinies did what they could to help. I see wonderful, caring friendships developing among them, and Evan had been fairly quiet during this exchange. Piping up, he added, I agree, Jax. Louis has been an exceptional leader all the way through, and that's one reason he is so in awe of Jesus Christ. With a frown, the professor argued, Louis learned everything he needed to know from the servant leadership course. Don't forget that. If Jesus was an actual historical figure, I'd agree that he had some good things to say, and he did set a fine example. But I'm sure he got his ideas from other compassionate humans who evolved the same type of morality. But we have to accept Jesus as either a truth-teller or a complete fraud, Seth pointed out. Jesus didn't claim to be just a good man. He claimed to be the only source of truth and the Son of God. He said he learned everything from his Father, God. He didn't speak his own opinions. He encourages us in the Bible to be merciful and kind because God, our Father, is merciful and kind. Jesus didn't try to be better than the God of the Old Testament. Jesus showed us who God really is. Folding his arms across his chest, the redhead pointed out, many people today are misrepresenting the God of the Old Testament and unfairly distorting his laws. But don't forget that Christian morality made the world a better place. Nations who based their morals on Christian ethics gradually transformed Western civilizations from the darkness of oppression and tribal warfare to a time of great accomplishments and compassionate freedom. Folding his arms together, the professor argued, yes, but Christians also started brutal wars, promoted slavery, and oppressed women. Think of the Crusades. True. People have struggled with how to implement God's rules, Seth explained. Their harsh or lax implementations have sometimes created a bad reputation for God's laws, which were intended to save lives, minimize hurt, and establish order. I don't see God's truth as the problem. Human implementation of that truth is where we go wrong. Too many feel that the end justifies the means. But that isn't scriptural. Viciously forcing people to convert was never condoned by God and doesn't bring about the willing devotion that he desires. Raising his eyebrows, Seth prodded, Professor Lemans, who do you think has done more harm in the world, Christians or atheists? Christians for sure, the professor replied without hesitation. It's not just the Crusades that took many innocent lives. Think of the Inquisition. Seth nodded. And we could argue about who was worse, the Christian Crusaders and the Inquisition, which slaughtered millions of people, or 20th century atheistic regimes like Stalin and Mao that wiped out tens of millions. But to debate this wouldn't actually prove anything, as those instigating the crimes may not have been acting upon their core beliefs. Jax looked at him with a quizzical expression. Well, Jesus told his followers that those who take up the sword will perish with the sword, Seth explained. He never encouraged his followers to force others to believe like the church did in the Crusades and the Inquisition. Instead, we are commanded to forgive, to suffer ourselves to be defrauded, to do good to those who do evil to us. The Christian Crusades and the Inquisition were not motivated by the teachings of Christ, but by power, greed, and misplaced zeal. Evan nodded. It makes sense to say we need to look at the foundational principles to see which worldview encourages true caring and compassion, and which one leads to selfishness and a lack of regard for the sanctity of human life. Pondering the discussion, the professor wasn't as antagonistic as he had been in previous conversations with Seth. He appreciated the answers the two young men were giving, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. A digression was therefore in order. It is somewhat of a mystery that compassion and kindness evolved, he acknowledged, yet you are saying that our hearts are full of evil. So compassion and kindness is a mystery to Christians as well. Fair point, Seth conceded with a smile. Evil comes from our hearts since the fall, but a moral conscience and goodness was implanted into us by God at the very beginning. He created us in His image and called us very good on the sixth day. He wants us to be like Him. Finding Luke chapter 6 on his phone, Seth read, Jesus says, "But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for He is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful." Looking up, Seth said, "The goodness you see in people is from God. Jesus encouraged us to follow His Father's example. God hasn't changed." "I don't agree," Jax argued as a smile crossed his face. "If there was anyone like Jesus around today, I'm sure, as Dawkins says, he'd be so impressed by scientific progress and reason, he'd be a moral atheist." Evan and Seth looked at each other with surprise. A moral atheist?" Seth clarified, frowning. "I don't think so. Not the man who came to do his Father's will, who spoke his Father's word, and stated plainly that God was his God. Jesus wasn't a better God. He is the perfect manifestation of God." With a shrug, the professor's eyes twinkled. He did enjoy stirring Seth up. However, when it came to discussing controversial subjects, he had met his match. Seth also welcomed debates. Returning to their discussion on morality, the young redhead added, "Many scientists have become so proud of their ability to discover and harness the laws of the universe that they think that purpose, ethics, and morality can also be discovered through logic and science. The world is in a mess because we have discarded God's standards and we can't agree on what our own should be. Natural selection can't evolve morality. It's opposed to morality. Only a being much greater and wiser than ourselves, who wants the best for us, has the authority to determine right from wrong." Seeing some action within the dome, Evan walked closer to peer in. He whispered, "Hey, look what Odin has." Getting up from his chair, the professor strode over. Seth hurried to look in. In his carry cart, Odin was proudly pushing a big, shiny red gem to the store. "You found one of the treasures," Jax exclaimed softly. "The first one." "But not the best," Evan smiled. "What's the best?" Seth asked quietly, looking up at his friend. "The sun catcher," Evan whispered. He pointed to where Odin had been digging. "If he digs a little closer to the trench on the right side of the hill, he'll find it. He's getting very close." The storekeepers were outside as Odin approached. Nancy and Milan were playing with Rusty, throwing apples for him to run and catch. Often the friendly dog ate the apple, and occasionally he brought it back in his mouth. Stopping their game, they looked up when Odin swaggered over. "Look what I found," he boasted. "This beats all trades." In awe, Milan ran to get some water to wash off the gem. Once it was clean, it sparkled a brilliant red in the sunshine. "You found a treasure, all right," the slim storekeeper agreed in amazement, examining the large gem that he could barely lift. "Everyone has been hoping to find it. Others will be willing to trade a lot for this." Wiping his hands gleefully, Odin declared, "Well, I'd say this beauty is worth at least a month or two of free meals, and maybe a haircut. I'm sure it will also pay back for any inconvenience I've ever caused." "You mean by it will pay back for any inconvenience?" Nancy inquired. "Well, like my latest science experiments that went poorly," Odin explained, shuffling back and forth on his feet. "If I trade this in, then I've paid back for everything that everyone blames me for." Nancy and Milan shared a look. "It is special," she murmured to her helper. "Others will trade highly for it," he agreed. "Whatever you think, Nancy." Standing up straight, Nancy folded her arms across her chest and made her best offer. "I'm willing to trade 4 weeks of free meals. But I can't say this pays for the damage you've caused. That's another issue, and that's not for me to decide." Odin stood his ground. 6 weeks, a haircut, and I don't have to do any more work. "A haircut for sure," Milan bargained with a wry smile. 2 weeks of meals and no more work. But that's not our decision, Nancy protested. We should ask Uncle Louie about the work part. My land's deal sounds good to me, Odin chuckled. Take it or leave it. The storekeepers looked at each other and shrugged. Odin turned and strode off to the forest. Well, there goes his self-inflicted consequences, the professor remarked softly with chagrin. I guess the stone staircase remains unfinished. And who will haul the water and supplies back and forth? Evan queried. I suppose we should be happy he showed remorse for 2 days, Jack said sadly, shaking his head. One bright gem, and he thinks he's made up for all the harm he's brought on the others. Ironically, the gem isn't even his, Evan mused. It belonged to you, Jax. You hid it there. All he did was find it. Chapter 10. A Secret Message. When all the dressings had been changed later that morning, Uncle Louie motioned for Amy to come over. Anything I can get for you, Uncle Louie? She asked, walking over cheerfully. A very clean Lily had brought him his breakfast several hours ago, and now she was sitting beside Poncy, holding his hand and reading a book about a family camping adventure. The small freckle-faced girl was bravely persevering to read, even though there was a very bad smell in the room. Zahir had gone back to sleep. The father hastily set up the tent, Lily read, while thunder echoed all around and the skies turned an ominous gray. Suddenly, his youngest son called out to him. Did you know, Lily suddenly interjected, that in the big world a guy marries a girl and they have children? Why don't we have fathers and mothers, or get married, or have babies? Our world is not quite the same, Uncle Louie chuckled. But can we get married? Can I marry Poncy? Poncy was half asleep, but his eyes opened wide. Married? He asked. What are you saying, Lily? Uncle Louie nodded. Yes, you could get married if you are very sure about each other. Why do we have to be sure? Because marriage is a promise to care about someone for your whole life, he told her. Smiling at her injured friend, the brown-haired girl exclaimed, I will always love Poncy. You and me, Lily, her friend mumbled dreamily, closing his eyes. The lunch bell sounded from the store. I'll be back later, Lily said, kissing the hand she was holding. Once Lily had gone and both patients were slumbering, Uncle Louie reached into the pocket of his dressing gown and pulled out an envelope. I want you to go somewhere very private and read this, he whispered to Amy. If you are confused by anything, you can ask me secretly when everyone else is asleep. Do you understand? Intrigued, Amy took the envelope, wondering what the message could possibly be about. She felt something hard and small inside that moved when she tilted the package. Kenzie and Vahid entered the room and picked up the urinals. Okay, girls out, they said. Time for the male nurses to take over. Amy left and closed the door. She heard Uncle Louie say, I think we may all need a good wash today. Running out into the clear, sunny air, Amy breathed it in deeply. Even though the windows were always open in the caring center, the smell had been steadily worsening. Holding on to her envelope, Amy saw Lily was still talking to Odin. He had just brought up a pot of clean water and left it in front of the mansion. Thanks for the water, she called out, wondering why he hadn't brought it all the way to the crisis room. And that stair pathway will be so helpful once it's done, she added gratefully. Thank you, Odin. Lily smiled. Yes, I can get to the store so much faster now, she agreed. And stairs are especially good when we have to use the outhouse in the middle of the night. It's the last pot of water I'm bringing, he told them proudly. What? Amy asked, stopping in her tracks. I found a precious treasure in Mining Hill, he shrugged. I've traded it in for everything I've done wrong. No one can blame me any more for anything. You'll have to find some other slave to carry water and finish the staircase. But you were doing such a great job, Amy protested earnestly. Why wouldn't you want to finish your work and feel a sense of accomplishment? Couldn't you do just 3 more steps? And we need those pots of fresh water every day to keep our patients clean and healthy." "Find another slave," Odin smiled, turning around. "I'm free." Disappointed, Amy parted company with the others, taking the path to the lake, while Lily ran to the store. She knew someone would likely volunteer to bring water and carry the used materials back to the train, but she was discouraged that Odin's attitude had soured once again. Not particularly hungry and eager to read the secret letter, Amy wasn't concerned to miss lunch. Santa was always bringing food up to the mansion in between meals. Good friends are reliable like that, she thought. Down by the water, the young nurse observed that the waves were just beginning to roll in. The beach seemed so lonely and forsaken. Walking out onto the pier, she reflected sadly, all the surfers are in the caring center. Dangling her legs in the cool, refreshing water, the young lady with the wavy copper-brown hair opened her envelope and looked inside. She saw a strange metal shape and a single piece of folded paper. Pulling out the note, she read, "To Amy from the Professor and Evan." Her deep blue eyes grew large in astonishment. Never would she have dreamed that the professor would write a private letter to her. He was the mastermind of paradise. With great anticipation, she opened it up. It was a long letter. "Dear Amy," she read, "now that Uncle Louis can no longer communicate with us, we are giving this important assignment to you. Please be very careful who you share these details with. If you can, keep it a secret unless we tell you otherwise. The communication device you will need to operate is a powerful and potentially dangerous tool. It can educate you in many good ways, but if used wrongly, it may cause harm. We feel you will be responsible to use this tool in a positive and helpful way. This is one very important reason we have chosen you." The message carried on, telling her how to find the secret cave where all the communication would take place. She was told to take the key out of the envelope and not to lose it, or tell anyone else about it. The key would unlock the door of the cave and turn everything on. The key would unlock the door of the cave. When she got inside and closed the door, she would find a large black rectangular device on the wall. She was to push in the side button and look for a white dove symbol on the screen and press on it. Then she was to touch Evan's name for a video message. Amy swallowed hard and looked around. With such fervent requests for secrecy, she hoped she wasn't being watched. Thankfully, no one else was in sight, as most had headed to the store for lunch. Carefully, she read the letter over a second time. She had often wondered about the window in the cave and just how Uncle Louis communicated with the professor. It was a mystery. She was very excited to discover how it all happened. "It's not just a regular window," she considered, looking at the details in the professor's letter. "It's a device. It has to be turned on. It's a powerful tool and a source of information. What is this thing? What is a video message? And they've chosen me? Why me? This is so strange and yet very special." With a rush of euphoria, Amy tucked the letter back inside the envelope with the key, determined to make her discoveries right away. From the lake, she walked stealthily around the back of Rainbow Hill, as she had been told, keeping well hidden in the trees. She was surprised that a number of the trees had fallen on the hill, and it was annoying to climb over them all. In the valley between the two hills, she walked back and forth a couple of times before seeing the faint pathway that led toward a large rock. Sure enough, the fake rock moved easily, and the key worked. She entered a dark room as the door closed behind her, and she felt for the lever. It worked. A light came on. The large black rectangular device was easy to spot, but it didn't look much like a window. She couldn't see through it at all. Feeling around the edges, she eventually discovered the long, narrow side button. Exerting some force, she managed to push it in. To her great surprise and wild delight, the whole box lit up with glowing colors. There were many symbols to choose from, and one was a white bird. She pushed on it. Up came a small picture of Evan, just as she remembered him from the nursery. His blonde hair stood up in a wild fashion, just as it had before. There was also a picture of an older man with only a partial gray beard. Beside his face were the words, "The Professor." "What?" Amy said with astonishment. "This is the professor?" She studied him carefully. He looked wise and kind, but not particularly powerful. "This is The mastermind of paradise? She marveled. When she pushed on Evan's name, the screen lit up and he stood motionless in the window. She saw the little white triangle on his face that she had been told to touch. Trying it out, she was astonished when Evan began to speak. "Hi, Evan!" she exclaimed excitedly. But Evan just kept on talking as if he hadn't heard her. Perplexed, Amy listened to his message. The tall young man with the spiky blonde hair explained everything, using his own phone to show her how to send messages or make phone calls, and telling her what it would look like should she receive a message from them. "We would like you to come here every night when the others have gone to bed," Evan said, "or sometime during the day when everyone is occupied elsewhere. We don't want you to draw any unnecessary attention to what you are doing. Message us every day with the nursing report on all the burn victims. Call us any time if you have concerns. If Paradise needs supplies, let us know and we'll put them on the train and send it in the morning." "Okay," she replied. "I will." Evan didn't seem to hear her. He ran his fingers through his hair awkwardly as though he were wondering what to say next. Then he added, "Well, that's enough for today. We'll take you through a few other features next time. Goodbye, Amy." The picture stopped moving. Evan stopped talking. The white triangle appeared on his face again. So maybe that was a video message, Amy thought to herself, admiring all the other colorful symbols on the screen. She looked around the room. It had a little desk in one corner with a messy pile of papers spread out on top and project instructions pinned to the walls. A chair was positioned in front of the phone. At the back of the room was a table covered with a long cloth that hung all the way to the ground. Fascinated, Amy could hardly wait to come back. The floor was quite dirty near the table. Amy looked around for a broom, but she couldn't see one. "Well, I should try to give the professor a report," she thought, pressing on the round circle with his face. The picture came up in a large square, and she pressed on the symbol that Evan had showed her in his video. Immediately, music began, and the screen became larger. Then the professor's face appeared, only he was smiling and moving right away without any triangle to press. "Hello, Amy," he said gently. A little frightened, Amy said, "Hi, I'm Amy." "Yes, I know," he smiled. "I've been hoping you would call. I'm the professor. How are your patients?" Amy sucked in her breath. The professor was really talking to her? He could hear what she said? He was asking her questions? Once Amy got over her initial feelings of intimidation, the conversation went well. She told him all he wanted to know about her patients and their wounds. "The next couple of days will be difficult," he warned her. "We are worried about infection setting in. You must monitor their temperatures and let us know right away if anything changes. We can send in stronger medication if there are problems. You can call me or text any time, day or night." He encouraged Amy to try a few different messaging options, just to ensure she knew how to use the system. When everything was sorted out, they both said a friendly goodbye. "He's nice," Amy thought with a smile. "I think I like him. He reminds me a little bit of Uncle Louie. He's just a lot younger." Leaving the cave, Amy locked the door tightly and rolled the fake stone back into place. "Now, how can I keep the key safe?" she wondered. Her dress didn't have a pocket. A small rock lay close by. It seemed like a good idea to hide the key under it, so that it would always be there when she came back. Carefully positioning the key under the rock, she left it there and ran to the shower. She knew it was very important for anyone who went outside the caring center to wash themselves well before they came back in, which meant she was now showering several times a day. A huge pile of towels had come in on the train and had been stacked nearby. When she was finished, she hung her wet towel on the clothesline to dry. Making her way back up Rainbow Hill, Amy met Charlie, Vahid, Tina, and Yuyan near the clearing. To her surprise, they were taking down the solar lights. When she asked about it, Charlie told her that Uncle Louie had asked for the lights to be strung outside the mansion, especially around her big window, so that the nurses could see in the dark. "Oh, that's a great idea," she smiled. "Thank you." By the time Amy reached the house, her dress and hair were nearly dry. Looking at the time on the clock, she realized it was mid-afternoon, and almost time to change the dressings again and give out the medications. Washing her hands carefully, she brought the materials into the room. The sun was streaming in through her big window, but Zahir and Ponzi were sound asleep and tossing restlessly. She could hear the other nurses across the hall talking to the Beach Boys. Uncle Louie looked up and whispered, "Did it work?" Running over to his bedside, she kneeled down. Quietly, but with astonishment, she told him, "I saw Evan, and he told me what to do. And then I talked to the professor. I actually talked to him. He's very nice." "Good girl," Uncle Louis sighed happily. "Now, if something happens to me, you can take over." With an anxious frown, Amy asked warily, "What do you mean, Uncle Louis? I need you here." "The professor has chosen you," he told her. "Why?" she inquired. Squeezing her hand, Uncle Louis breathed deeply. His lined face was filled with deep emotion. "Because he feels he can trust you, Amy. Make sure you always treasure that trust," he whispered. "It's very important for the safety of everyone in paradise that the professor can trust someone to tell him the truth and to do what he asks. Do you understand that?" Amy nodded fervently. "Good," he sighed. "I believe you will do your best." Zahir cried out in his sleep, and for a moment Amy and Uncle Louis were distracted. He and Ponzi looked quite flushed. "I have something special to tell you," the older Tiny said softly. Not knowing how long he had left, he felt it was important for Amy to understand her relationship with the professor. "You see," he said, "in the real world, the professor's world, people do get married, just like Lily was saying. A man marries a woman, and they have children." "Really?" Amy clarified eagerly, her eyebrows raised. "Yes," he nodded. "After my heart attack, when I was in the emergency bed, the professor told me that you and I, well, we are his real children." Amy looked bewildered. "We weren't born in a normal way," he explained. "It's complicated, Amy. But had things been normal, you and I would be brother and sister. The professor is our father, and his wife, who died young, is our mother." This was astonishing information. For a moment or two, Amy was completely overwhelmed by the concept. "But what about everyone else?" she begged. "Where did they come from?" Uncle Louis shrugged. "Somehow the professor was able to incubate children from other fathers and mothers. I'm not exactly sure how," he told her. "He didn't tell me where everyone else was from." Amy was reeling with all she had learned. "What does this mean?" she asked. Shifting slightly against the pillows, Uncle Louis smiled. "It means that you and I are more responsible than anyone else for what happens in paradise. The professor expects more from us. We have to make sure that paradise stays happy and beautiful because that's what our Father longs for." Nodding, Amy took a deep breath. She remembered thinking that the professor and Louis looked similar. "Do I look like my mother?" she wondered curiously. "When I'm gone," Uncle Louis continued, "you will be one of the next leaders of paradise. You will have to think about what is best for everyone, not just what is best for you. It is very important to keep this perspective. And Amy," he cautioned, "don't tell any others about this special relationship you have with the professor, or they may become jealous. You must keep it a secret." It was all a little frightening. Amy wasn't sure she was ready to think about what was best for everyone else and to keep so many secrets. "Nothing can happen to you, Uncle Louis," she whispered, covering his hand with hers. "You have to stay with us. I couldn't be a leader without you." Uncle Louis smiled and squeezed her hand. Zahir cried out again. "Go help him," Uncle Louis encouraged. "I am worried about him and Ponzi. I had the guys give us sponge baths just to keep us all clean. Infection is a deadly thing." Looking up at the clock, Amy could see it was time for the pain medication to be given out. She squeezed the dose into a cup and took it to Zahir. His face was red and sweaty. He barely opened his eyes, and he wasn't responsive to her request to drink. Laying her hand on his forehead, she realized that Zahir felt abnormally hot. Taking the long thermometer out from under Ponzi's bed and following the instructions that had been sent in, she inserted the nib under his arm. Uncle Louis watched anxiously. Counting slowly to 60, Amy checked the number. "Zahir's temperature is a little high," she relayed to Uncle Louis. "Should we be worried?" "Write it down and we'll keep a close eye on him," Uncle Louis assured her. "Make him drink some more and then, well, you know what to do, right, Amy?" Looking over, Amy understood that Uncle Louis wanted her to go to the cave and give a report. She nodded. Writing down Zahir's details, she tried to give him the balanced salt solution, but Zahir shook his head, refusing to drink or open his eyes. He doesn't want any, Amy reported. Speaking with a stern voice, Uncle Louis said, "See here? You have to drink if you want to get better. Force yourself, my boy." Realizing she had to insist, Amy held the cup up to his lips and tried again. "Please, Zahir," she begged firmly. "Please drink this. You need to get better." Reluctantly, Zahir drank, but he still didn't open his eyes. Gradually, Amy coaxed him into drinking a lot, but not everything. Yu Yan arrived, and they both struggled to get Ponzi to drink as well. He was sleeping soundly, and his temperature was also over 38 degrees Celsius. After they had forced both patients to drink, Amy, Tina, and Yu Yan did the afternoon rounds, caring for all their patients, taking their temperatures, and recording all the details. Tina called out for more ointment, so Amy brought her some. Damien and Lima were sitting up and playing chess in George's old room. Taking the tub of ointment, Tina rubbed it into Fran's leg wound. Santa, Vina, and Dia were crowded around the players and were talking excitedly about Odin's new treasure in the store. "Now we know it's true," Santa was telling the others. "There really are treasures in Mining Hill. The red stone is so shiny and beautiful." Looking over at Amy, she said, "Wait till you see it. You'll be amazed. Light passes right through it." "I'm going to trade for it," Dia insisted. There was a crestfallen look on Santa's face. Out of all of them, Dia could always make the best trades. Being the only seamstress, her clothes were always in high demand. Lima looked over at Santa. "When I'm out of here, we'll have to go digging," he sang out. "Yes, we will," Santa laughed, clapping her hands excitedly. "I wonder what other gems we'll find." "I'm in," Fran said. "Me too," Dia agreed, sewing sequins onto a shirt as she kept one eye on the chess game. "Ah, you'll just stand there telling everyone else what to do," France retorted. "If you get the red gem, why would you need more?" Dia tossed her head haughtily. "If you actually listened to me, you might find the treasure." Vanitha looked up shyly. "Have you seen Odin's haircut?" she asked everyone. Amy was surprised. "Really?" she asked. "He got his hair cut?" Nodding, Vanitha relayed, "He wanted it short, and it looks really good on him." "This I will have to see," Amy exclaimed. "Checkmate!" Damien laughed, closing in on Lima's king. "No way!" Lima protested. "Let me check the rules." But it was a fair win, and the game was over. Dia cheered loudly for Damien. Watching the others interact, Amy was confident there were no concerns to report with the Beach Boys. Their temperatures were normal, their eyes were bright and lively, and all their wounds were healing fast.